This is the book that made me realize and allowed me to acknowledge, frankly, that my mother wasn't just a bystander in my childhood. She was a significant part of the story. There's a part of childhood abuse that we don't talk about very often. We talk about the abuser, we talk about the survivor, but we don't often talk about the parent who knew but didn't stop it. So this book, The Ultimate Betrayal, The Enabling Mother, Incest, and Sexual Abuse, is one of the first places that I ever saw the dynamic actually named. I purchased this book back in 2010, just 7 days before my marriage to my first husband. I was looking for answers, and my life was in chaos. My childhood trauma had come to light. My father had been arrested, and I thought, perhaps naively, that everything would change after that, but it didn't. I truly thought that my mother would step up and protect us and protect my siblings. I was convinced that now that he was stuck in jail, she had her way out. I had done that for her. Instead, she bailed him out. And I remember feeling just completely disoriented because I didn't have the language or really understanding about why this was still happening. I didn't understand how my mother could say that she believed me and believed us and still chose him over all of her children. So I bought this book looking for answers. At its core, this book explores something deeply, deeply uncomfortable: the role that some mothers play in enabling abuse. While I would never blame my mother for the abuse my father did, because she is not the perpetrator, this book really helped me to see and allowed me to fully accept her role in the abuse that she did contribute to. Not as the primary abuser, but as someone who ignored it, minimized it, or even in some case protected the perpetrator. The author, Audrey Ricker, talks about how enabling behaviors from a mother is actually much more common than most people would realize. And for me, that was the first time I realized that I wasn't alone in this experience. There were a few things in this book that really stood out to me. And the biggest one was this idea of loyalty that the author talks about. That in many of these family systems, there's often a strong emotional loyalty to the mother, even when she failed to protect you. And that really was true in my situation as well, because even after everything, for a very long time, I still felt that loyalty. Another piece that resonated was how the book describes mothers who see what's happening and choose not to act. Not always out of cruelty, but out of their own fear or conditioning, dependency, or denial. And seeing that dynamic written out so clearly just really helped me to start to process my own story in a way that I hadn't been able to before. So how is this book structured? Well, the book isn't just theory, it's actually very interactive. And there are sections that walk you through reflecting on your own childhood, identifying patterns in your childhood, and really sitting with how those experiences affected you. The first time I read it, I was actually on an airplane, which was a terrible spot because I ended up sobbing most of the flight. But I was writing in the margins. I was answering the prompts. I was trying to make sense of things. I love that I have notes on almost every single page because when I read it 15 years later, it really helped me to see where I was at that original time I read it. But there's a whole section in the book that actually provided 5 individual therapy sessions that you go through independently to evaluate your own upbringing, your mother's contribution to that upbringing, and then how it makes you feel. The first time I read this, I was heavily struggling with looking at my emotions in the light that I really needed to view them in. And these questionnaires and these reflections gave me a good opportunity to really reflect on how I was feeling and really label the behaviors that she did that created this huge rift between us and why it made me feel so betrayed. And honestly, it gave me a framework for a lot of emotions that I hadn't really allowed myself to feel or hadn't really allowed myself to understand yet. That being said, this book isn't perfect either. I read it again last month in anticipation of talking about it on this channel and sharing how positive it had been of an experience for me the first time I read it. And reading it with so many years later with a lot more healing and perspective, I will say I saw it a little bit differently. There are parts of this book that feel very overgeneralized. The author makes broad statements about how survivors behave, suggesting things like self-destructive tendencies or certain patterns don't apply to everyone. And some of that didn't sit super well with me as the second time I read it, because trauma doesn't look the same for everyone, and I think it's not fair to generalize in that way. There were also some sections, especially around relationships and sexuality, that felt quite a bit outdated and honestly quite a bit judgmental. One reviewer, Christy, that I found on Goodreads, captured some of the things I was feeling really well. So I'm just going to read what she wrote because she did it so eloquently. She wrote, "She, the author, is at turns judgmental and non-judgmental, using shaming language to describe clients' sex lives, but reassuring us it's not the victim's fault that she's so promiscuous. At a later point, she makes a comment about how it's wrong to withhold sex from someone you can, quote, reasonably be expected to owe it to. WTF, in what universe is sex owed to anyone at any time? I can't think of a more horrible way to frame such an issue for people who've had their own personal autonomy ripped out of their hands countless times." I think Christy worded really well some of the concerns I had about a couple of those small sections in the book. So I think this is just one of those books that you need to take what resonates and maybe leave what doesn't. The first time I read this book, I was still deep in the pain of everything. I was still trying to understand my mother. I was still giving her a lot of the benefit of the doubt. And I still was really holding on to the idea that she was only a victim. Reading it again recently, and of course after 15 years of therapy and coming to terms with this and no longer having a relationship with my mother, I had a very different reaction. I didn't cry when I read it this time, and that alone, of course, just tells you how much I've changed and healed. And I really, as I read through my own prior notes in the margins, I saw a lot of clarity. And I reflected that 15 years ago, I gave my mother far too much benefit of the doubt the first time I read it. I had much more clarity this time that I do understand that while she was influenced and while she was controlled by my father in many, many ways, she still made those choices. And those choices had consequences for all of us in our family. So I think the most important thing this book really gave me at the time in 2010 was language. Language to understand that a parent can be both shaped by their environment and even be a victim themselves, while also still be responsible for what they allowed to happen. Regardless of some of the concerns I mentioned earlier, I would still recommend this book if you're trying to understand complex family dynamics, if you had a parent, especially a mother who didn't protect you, or if you're looking for a starting point to process that experience. But I would also say go into it with a grounded mindset, because not everything will apply to you and not everything in it is perfect, that's for sure. For me, this book was a starting point when I needed it. It helped me to untangle something that felt really impossible to understand at the time. And sometimes that's what healing looks like. Not one huge breakthrough that's going to fix everything, but small pieces of clarity over time, one step at a time, that slowly change how you see your past and help you figure out how to move forward. This book really helped me to reflect on and understand my mother's role when I really had no understanding of it in the first place. But understanding it, as always, is actually very different than facing it and facing what it meant for me. That would take a lot more years and it'd be its own separate journey. But this was an awesome place for me to start. If you've read this book or had a similar experience, I'd be really curious what your takeaway was. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Did you kind of do what I did, is pick sections you really enjoyed and throw out the ones that didn't apply or were a little too judgmental for you? And if this is still something you're trying to make sense of, I really do recommend you check out the book and see if it will help. You are not alone in this journey. And with that last thought, I just want to say thank you again, as always, for being here. I'm Janae Cherie, and I hope that my story helps you to tell yours.